The first reading for this third Sunday of Lent gives us a lot to think about. We are all familiar with this passage, having heard it many times. In the Hebrew Bible, these aren't called the commandments, but simply the 10 words. Maybe that can change how we hear and respond to them, not as mere laws and as regulations, but more as a way to understand God and what He wants for us. They tell us what God hates and rejects, and what we should as well. The first of these words or commandments is the greatest. There is only one God, and we must reject all false gods. To understand the importance of this commandment, we need only consider what did the idols of the Hebrews' neighbors have their worshipers do? Perform human sacrifice, even of their own children. Participate in orgies and fornication. Perform magic rituals to hopefully control the idol gods and bind them to human desires. They mistake matter for spirit, mistake nature for the creator of nature. All this kind of idol worship, albeit by other names, is alive and well in our own time. So getting back to basics really does start here with the first commandment. In the Gospel of St. John, Jesus' miracles are called signs. They are meant to show Jesus' glory, His true identity, and that He has come from God. In this week's passage from that Gospel, Jesus performs a healing of an injured, compromised space, not of a sick person. Jesus dramatically clears out of the temple all those who were there doing business. After this, the authorities want Him to provide a sign to back up what He is doing and saying. Jesus is in Jerusalem, inside the temple, where He and the disciples and their fellow Jews all went to worship. The temple built by Herod in Jerusalem would be right up there with the greatest of the Christian churches of today. Herod was not a religious person, but he built a temple not only to please the Jews, but to make Jerusalem a destination city, a place that people would come to from all over the world and worship and admire His power and spend their money. We cannot underestimate the importance of this event, told in today's Gospel, to what happens to Jesus in the events of Holy Week. Jesus was from way up north of Jerusalem, from Galilee. There, we hear a lot about Him arguing with Pharisees. The Pharisees lived all over Palestine, and they believed that scrupulously following not just the 10 words, but all the 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law was what God was most interested in. The Sadducees, however, were all about the temple and its rituals and liturgy. They thought what God was most interested in was people to come to visit Him in the temple and offer Him all sorts of animal sacrifices. So the Sadducees lived mostly in and around Jerusalem because that's where the temple was. And because peace and security was necessary for people to travel, the Sadducees had to be very cooperative with and get along with the Romans who maintained these safe conditions for travel and business. And the Romans depended on the Sadducees to keep things calm and peaceful in Palestine, the southeastern frontier of their empire. Therefore, the Sadducees had a lot of power and influence. Jesus didn't get into arguments with them or conflict with them until He came to Jerusalem, which He only did a few times as an adult. We hear about Him today on one of these visits, and He makes a big impression on that visit to the great temple. First, He gets everyone's attention not by teaching or performing miracles of healing, but by an action of seeming violence. He makes a whip and drives out all the sellers of sacrificial animals, all the money changers who exchange foreign currency for a profit, who were like pawnbrokers, taking whatever the poor had of value, turning it into cash at a discount, so the poor could buy an animal to sacrifice. He turns over their tables, spilling their money on the floor. You can just imagine the chaos, the noise, the frantic merchants, the bellowing animals. Interesting note, however, He doesn't violently attack those who only sold doves. He only reproves them and tells them to take their business elsewhere. Doves were the least expensive creatures and were bought by the poorest of the poor. Then, once Jesus has gotten everyone's attention, he makes a cryptic and shocking statement about destroying the temple. Jesus' words and actions seem to threaten the safety of the city, for worshipers, tourists, the sacredness of the temple, and surely the income of the priests. Jesus was acting as a prophet. We usually only think of their words, but the prophets performed dramatic actions as well. Jeremiah, an unpopular prophet with the king, broke a hole through the walls of Jerusalem and moved his whole household out through it in full vision of everyone to show what was going to happen to that city. So Jesus' words and actions in the temple jeopardized the autonomy of Jerusalem that was supposed to be kept calm and peaceful. It's no surprise that after this, the priests and the Sadducees wanted to kill him. All this time, it hadn't really mattered what the Pharisees thought about Jesus, or even Herod, the king of Galilee, who had killed John the Baptist. Jesus had now crossed the wrong crowd, and it ultimately cost him his life. We ourselves might think of events at Selma, Alabama, 56 years ago. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words and actions there cost him his life 53 years ago this April. 53 years ago, the positions of Robert Kennedy cost him his life. Many outspoken Russian opponents of President Putin have lost their lives in recent years. Environmental activists in Brazil and Central America who oppose rich and powerful business interests have also been assassinated. It's the way of the world. Jesus' words and actions teach us what idols we are supposed to avoid. He teaches us because, as those last words of the gospel today tell us, Jesus understands human nature very well, only too well. We are the church, the people of God, the house of God. We are individual temples of the Holy Spirit. We are to scrupulously avoid exploiting the weaknesses of others. We are not to make religion or spiritual things merchandise to be bought or sold. We are not to look for pieces of God's business for ourselves. Our life is not about living up to some deal with God and paying up with slaughtered animals, cash donations, or anything else. God cannot be bought and cannot be sold. Salvation and grace are not commodities we receive in exchange for keeping the commandments. They are God's free gifts of love to us, to be freely received by our loving back. I thank God as a priest that I don't have to slaughter any animals. We've managed to get past that. I wouldn't want to be a priest if I had to do it. But living up to the rest of what Jesus asks is a big challenge for all of us, as it was for Jesus' contemporaries. Profit making, taking advantage of the weaknesses of others, exchanging spiritual and material merchandise, making deals. This is a big part of our human lives, especially here in America. And most challenging for us is to be aware of the poor and the suffering, the disadvantaged, those so often taken advantage of, all who live out of our sight, in neighborhoods we never go to. It is a challenge for us to stand up for them. Of course, all of us are poor in some way, in some virtues. We suffer from some loss or psychological pain, some physical ailment or imperfection. We are disadvantaged in some skill or another. But Jesus' mission, his actions and words make it very clear. He said so himself. He came not for the healthy and the righteous, but for the poor, and those who recognize their own poverty, the disadvantaged, and those deprived of the goods of this world. He challenges us who are healthy and righteous, especially during Lent, to follow him and apply our words and actions to help them and to save them from their suffering. He challenges us to recognize and admit our spiritual poverty, our spiritual hunger, that we are futilely feeding with worldly stuff. He challenges us to act in solidarity with the poor and wretched refuse of this world. We fast from food and give up things we like so that we can feel their hunger and their emptiness, and so be more easily moved to act for them, just as Jesus did. The church calls this the preferential option for the poor. It may not make a lot of sense to us, and perhaps it seems unfair that we should suffer, or we may think it's futile, too little resources against such big problems. But the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than all of human strength. The poor we will always have with us, so that we always have many opportunities, so that we can always act like Jesus Christ and love them. The world needs our zeal for Jesus' mission and his good news. If we begin our good works according to God's will and his word, God himself will bring them to a successful conclusion. The Holy Spirit, working through us, can and will renew the face of the earth.